So, welcome everyone. Welcome to today's Dharma talk. Today, I'm calling the Dharma talk "Waking Up," being no one and connecting. So, today I'd like to focus on what waking up may mean, both at noble and ennobling levels, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Most of you know what I mean by noble and ennobling. And in that process, I'd like to highlight a few different perspectives of waking up. And these perspectives will include a Western psychological approach, a Zen approach, and a classic Theravada Buddhist approach. And I may also relate some personal experiences. And the reason I'm relating some personal experiences is not to make any claims to any great spiritual attainments or anything like that, but only to relate honestly about what I've noticed in my practice over the years. And so that if you ever have any similar experiences, they may be meaningful for you. So it's not about, creating an ego about what I've attained or what I've realized. It's about more like just being honest about things. So in my understanding, the term Buddha comes from the root word Bud, which means to awaken or to understand. So the Buddha is more an honorific title than a name, and it refers to someone who is awake or fully understands or fully realizes. And Western scholars have created the term Buddhism, which is an English and Pali mix. Pali is an ancient Indian language, and it's probably closest. It's a combination of a number of dialects at the time, but it's probably closest to what the Buddha actually spoke. And so, we have this westernized creation of a term called Buddhism, which there is no real translation for in Pali, other than to say, and when I lived in Thailand, when we talked about Buddhism, we talk about it as Buddhasasana, which means the teachings of the Buddha. The teachings of the Buddha, basically. So I've always understood Buddhism as being the teachings of the Buddha. And Buddhism, therefore, is really a conceptual framework. It's a very useful conceptual framework, but it is simply a conceptual framework. And if we can use it skillfully, like a classic analogy states, it becomes like a raft that we hold on to cross a raging river. So, we need it. We need that raft to cross the river, otherwise you'll be washed away. So as this analogy goes, on one side of the river, there is a dangerous jungle of entangling vines. And this has been compared to samsara, which is the wheel of suffering, basically. And on the other side of the shore, the other side of the river, there is the freedom of nibbana. And nibbana is the unconditioned and the reality of non-clinging. So I'll talk a little bit about nibbana a bit later. So coming back to this classic analogy, when we get to the other side, the other shore, on our raft, we don't pick up the raft and carry it with us along our journey, our furthering journey. But we leave this conceptual framework just as a conceptual framework. So I hope I'm making something clear here. There's another commonly cited analogy as well that I'm going to refer to, which is has the same kind of meaning. And this is that Buddhism is like a finger pointing to the moon. And sometimes we mistake the finger for what it's pointing to. I'm pointing that way. Sometimes we mistake the finger for what it's pointing to. And what Buddhism is pointing to is the realization of nibbana. And this is what I would call noble awakening. It involves the realization of Nibbana. And there is also ennobling awakening. Ennobling awakening may not involve the realization of Nibbana, but it is on the path towards this realization. And in my view, ennobling awakenings may also involve significant realizations that could be called therapeutic. In my view, that's just my opinion. That is, we may clearly see an unwholesome or unhelpful psychological pattern and wake up to it. And in doing so, we are no longer bound under its spell. We're no longer under the spell of that pattern or no longer driven by that pattern. When we wake up to it, we realize, oh, that's a lot of suffering, and I choose not to do that. So that, yeah, in this case, it's therapeutic, and it's also, because it's not involving Nibbana or the realization of, ultimate freedom, it's called ennobling. Okay. So coming from a Western psychological perspective, I read a research paper by someone called Steve Taylor, a research practitioner psychologist, actually. And he defined awakening experiences as, and I'm just going to read this, temporary expansion and intensification of awareness in which our state of being, our vision of the world, and our relationship to it are transformed, bringing a sense of clarity, revelation, and well-being. We perceive a sense of harmony and meaning and transcend our normal sense of separateness from the world, experiencing a sense of connection and even unity. That's really lovely. I really like this. He's got a book out, and I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called Awakening Experience or something like that. But he made that quote in a paper that was in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. And if people want it, I can give you the references a bit later. So in this paper, Taylor writes about his research into what triggers awakening experiences. And the most frequent triggers are psychological turmoil. Psychological turmoil, which in my view correlates to how we understand the Four Noble Truths, or the Four Ennobling Truths, as a sequence. Do you remember that? You remember me talking about it as a sequence? And if you don't remember me talking about that because you've never heard me talk about it, this refers to how this dukkha and dukkha meaning suffering or unsatisfactoriness, the first noble truth, is the first noble truth. The second noble truth is the origins of dukkha. The third noble truth is freedom from dukkha. And the fourth noble truth is the way to freedom. The way this was presented in the first discourse was almost like as if tasks or in a sequence. It was presented in that sequence, dukkha first, then the second truth and the third truth and the fourth truth and so on. So what this refers to is that when we can understand the first noble truth, when we can understand dukkha, when we look into it, turn towards it, understand it, that leads us to the second truth. And then what happens with the second truth, the task of the second truth, the origins of dukkha, refers to releasing the causes of suffering. So the task of the first truth, dukkha, is to understand it. The task of the second truth is to release the suffering, which sequences onto the third truth. When you release the cause of suffering, you don't experience suffering, and you have the realization of freedom from suffering, regardless of whether it's noble or ennobling, regardless of whether it's absolute or relative, to the extent that you let go of the causes of your particular suffering, to that extent, you're going to have a particular freedom from suffering. And the task of the third truth, being at a noble level, is nibbana. The task of that truth is to realize it, to recognize it, to recognize it and realize it. And then when that happens, it leads on to the fourth truth, which is ironically living the path, practicing the path of right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, which is the Eightfold Path. And the task of that path is to live it, to practice it. So what we have here is that when we realize dukkha, that leads on to that. When we understand and realize dukkha, that leads on to that freedom from dukkha. So this is what I think is very interesting about how Stephen Taylor, in his research about awakening experiences, says the most common form of awakening is a result of psychological turmoil, which, interestingly, and this is what he talks about in his paper as well, puts a new light on post-traumatic stress disorder, highlighting the fact that these days there's a lot of research going into post-traumatic growth. And the research that Taylor talks about is called post-traumatic transformation, post-trauma transformation. Because he talks about this, he talks about these people who've been in war situations and gone through terrible experiences. And as a result, they've needed to kind of, excuse me a minute, I'm just going to mute someone. Thanks. So as a result of going through those terrible experiences, they've been forced to look at their situation, they've been forced to look at themselves, and they wake up. Other triggers for awakening experience include being in nature, creative activities, taking psychoactive substances, and I would say psychedelic substances there, and sometimes no particular triggers, sometimes they're spontaneous, and sometimes it results from spiritual practice, which is what we're doing. In other words, he said that most often awakening experiences occurred outside of spiritual experiences, outside of spiritual practice, as if spontaneous or by accident, one could say. Now, I do remember Joseph Goldstein talking about awakening experience one time, and he said, yes, they're spontaneous or by accident, but if awakening experiences are by accident, well, meditation definitely makes us more accident prone. So just to kind of reassure you that you're on the right path, if you're going to be practicing meditation, don't wait for something horribly intense to come along before you wake up, or don't wait for it to happen without any effort, just kind of waiting for it to happen spontaneous. It might happen, but more than likely it may not. And Taylor also goes on to talk about how there's low, medium, and high intensity awakening experiences. A low intensity experience could be simply feeling a bit more aliveness, or a medium intensity experience could be the perception of universal compassion and a sense of connection. And a high intensity experience could be a complete dissolution of the ego. And the changes in people's lives with awakening experiences, and this is all from a Western psychological perspective, by the way, range from minimal to completely transformational. Those who experience awakening experiences report a shift in values, perspectives on things, relationships. And the reports are from being less egocentric to more altruistic, an increased sense of compassion, and a kind of shaking up of one's self systems. And another way we can say that is the shaking up of our egos. And shaking up of those self systems from being limited to having more possibilities, I would say. So of note, sorry, I'll just go back. I'm reading this now. Often there's a report of a new sense of optimism, trust, confidence, and comfort. And some reports go along to say they're transformed from psychological turmoil to love, peace, and the knowledge that all is well. So that's lovely, isn't it? Others report calmness and stillness and feeling of being comforted. Others report an increased sense of meaning and a sense of harmony. So what I want to take note of here is the feeling of the disillusion of ego alongside with a universal compassion and a sense of connection. From a different psychological perspective, and I'm talking about now Dan Siegel's work. Dan Siegel is a renowned research psychiatrist. He's done a lot in neuroscience. He's he's a wonderful presenter. He's really smart. And he's developed something called the Wheel of Awareness. And last year I listened to an interview conducted by Paul Gilbert with Dan Siegel. And he talked about this Wheel of Awareness, which is a kind of like a practice that they do. And at its hub is awareness or knowing. And around the rim of the spokes of the wheel, there are 4 areas of life. And these areas of life include the world and ourselves and all that is known. So what we have in these on the outer rim is the interior of the body. In other words, sensations, the bodily senses. And also we have around the edge of this wheel of awareness, we have touch, taste, smell, sight, and hearing, like the 5 physical senses. We also have mental activities. We're thinking about, the 6th sense there, and a sense of interconnection. Closer to the hub, we have these experiences of aware, open, peaceful, calm, receptive, and clear. And in the hub, we have awareness. And what's interesting about this wheel of awareness is that awareness can be aware of the experiences, like what we'd normally call like sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, the experience of the senses, for example, and also things out there. And awareness can also be aware of itself. It's like doing a U-turn on itself to be aware of itself, which is very familiar. I don't think Dan Siegel would call himself a Buddhist, and he's come to the wheel of awareness through his own, exploration and research and so on. But it aligns with many of the Buddhist practices. And Dan Siegel did a kind of, not a formal research on the wheel of awareness, but a general kind of inquiry about the wheel of awareness. And he would ask people what they've experienced when they practiced this, when they got into the practice of the wheel of awareness. And they responded with words like at home, empty but full, love, connected and timeless, which is sorts of experiences, the sorts of descriptions you hear about awakening experiences in general. You also hear this in relationship to awakening experiences within the Buddhist realm as well. And it's like they're the experience of the separate sense of ego as the center of the universe seems to dissolve away. And there is a sense of being part of something much greater, something boundless, interconnected and linked, which I feel is what happens with the heart practices. The four boundless divine abodes, for example, loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. When we have these experiences, it's like we move beyond a sense of separate self, and we open our hearts, and we can access what a famous quantum physicist called Arthur Zeonce has referred to, and in the interview with Paul Gilbert, Dan Siegel made this reference. He talked about the sea of potential. It's like what happens when we kind of break down this separate sense of self, the ego being at the center of the universe, and open up to a broader perspective, a more open, connected perspective. What we also access is this thing called the sea of potential, out of which everything arises. Interesting. Out of which comes a sense of connectivity, sorry. So coming to Buddhism now, awakening experiences are most often considered as those awakening related to Nibbana. And as you probably are well aware, in Buddhism, there's many different schools and traditions, and they all have a different kind of perspective on awakening. And I can't really talk about all the perspectives, but I did attend a great workshop or day of meditation or a retreat with Chan Master Gyogyo. And in that retreat, he talked about the different developments of Buddhism. And I found it really interesting the way he explained it. And he talked about early Buddhism as going through an approach which was called the path of abandonment. With early Buddhism, the way we see suffering, the cause of suffering is craving. So the path of abandonment is the path of letting go. So that was the way he described early Buddhism. Then Mahayana Buddhism, he described as the path of transformation. In this regard, you could consider Tantra and how we embrace various energies with Tantra and we transform them. We transform suffering to awakening. And the final path he talked about is the path of recognition. And here I would say that it's more aligned with Mahamudra in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the practice of silent illumination in Chan Buddhism, the practice of Dzogchen, as far as I understand what Dzogchen is, and Shikantaza in Japanese, Zen Buddhism. And also what I would say would be silent samadhi in Theravada Buddhism, or in the early Buddhist practices. So in Zen Buddhism, the term for awakening, in Japanese Zen Buddhism anyway, is satori. And this translates as comprehension and understanding. And in the Zen Buddhist tradition, satori refers to a deep experience of kensho. Kensho means literally seeing one's nature or essence. I'll just go back to the path of recognition. I'll just clarify what that means. With the path of recognition, which is more aligned with, the later Buddhist approaches and those approaches those meditations that I just mentioned, it's about recognizing from a Mahayana Buddhist perspective, recognizing what was already there, recognizing our Buddha nature, um, waking up to that. So it's a little bit different from the way we consider things in Theravada Buddhism, where, you know, what happens is with Theravada Buddhism, there's an understanding that the mind is defiled or distorted with kilesa. Kilesa are, you know, literally translated as mental distortions. So that's what we do with early Buddhist practice is we let go of the kilesa. We reduce the causes of suffering and we eventually let them go, and therefore we don't have suffering. So we move through, we identify the causes of suffering being craving, for example, and that whole chain reaction that happens from craving and crimming and grasping and so on. And then we just let go of that. So we abandon it. With Mahayana Buddhism, and here Mahayana Buddhism includes Japanese Zen Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. It's about recognizing and realizing what's already there. You know, our Buddha nature, the awakened perspective. And it's like rather than letting go of things, which you do, of course, it's the same process, but it's considered as removing the veils of delusions to see what's already there. So it's awakening to something, it's awakening to our Buddha nature. So coming back to the Zen Buddhist approach, the experience of Kensho is seeing into one's true nature, literally. And I think there's various levels of that, or various levels of various depths of that. And for the last couple of years, I've been studying with a Zen Mahayana teacher, who also calls himself a Theravada teacher, called Stephen Snyder, and you've heard me mention his name a few times if you come to these days. And in Demystifying Awakening, that's a book he's written, he says that awakening experience need to have three components. So a deep experience of the absence of self, not self, or emptiness. Two, a recognition of one's true nature as one's true identity. Rather than identifying with the changing ego, one identifies with this awakened perspective, our Buddha nature. And three, a thorough unity experience where all is one and everything is in a fabric of oneness. In other words, everything's interconnected. And Stephen also talks about the absolute, which has two perspectives. The absolute is what we realize. We realize the absolute from a Zen Buddhist perspective. And he talks about this absolute as having two aspects, manifest and unmanifest. This is kind of interesting. The unmanifest is includes nibbana or nirvana, as they say it in Mahayana Buddhism or Sanskrit, and the vast spaciousness of emptiness, like the nothing of emptiness, that the nothingness of emptiness. And the manifest, absolute manifest, is also empty in the sense of emptiness being full to the brim with causes and conditions, that I'm just quoting Analia there. And it includes everything that arises from the unmanifest. This is coming back to that sea of potential that Zionts talks about. that I referred to earlier, that, you know, this nothingness is also this place, this sea of potential, has the capacity for everything to arise from it. Now, I'm only talking from Stephen Snyder's perspective. I'm not saying this is, you know, what every Buddhist talks about. So he talks about the manifest as being like a boundless sense of interconnection and wonder, awe. And I think sometimes it feels like we can connect to it with that. Like we might see someone or see something in life or be in life, and there's just this beautiful awesomeness about it. There's things arising, this beauty and connection. So what Stephen says is that Christians and Hindus tend to focus on the manifest, whereas Buddhists tend to focus on the unmanifest. And he's referring, and in Zen Buddhism, traditional Zen Buddhism, they never talk about the heart qualities. So they're never really talking about, you know, love and connection and so on. And they talk about going to the core of recognizing the absolute unmanifest, you know, this emptiness, this just thisness. So now coming to Theravada Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism, which is probably the most I associate with. Theravada Buddhism was a school of Buddhism that arose out of early Buddhism, early Buddhist practices. And there were a number of different schools, and this one is, Theravada is the one that's survived most strongly. But there are other schools related to early Buddhist practices. So in reference to freedom from dukkha and nibbana, and the practice in general, the Buddha often used analogies, similes, and metaphors to describe the nature of experiences, as elaborate verbal descriptions were simply inadequate. And this was especially the case for nibbana, which he was reported to have said, "This truth is profound, hard to see, hard to understand, peaceful and sublime, unattainable by mere reasoning, subtle to be experienced by the wise." And a metaphor he used for nibbana was an extinguishing of a fire. And according to one translation, nibbana is the same as nirvana, by the way. Nibbana is the Pali, nirvana is the Sanskrit. And according to one translation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, the near of nirvana refers to and vana refers to binding. I think another way of understanding this is as kind of like a fire. They often refer to the fires of craving and so on. So there's this analogy of being a flame. So, but what I'm saying here about unbinding, it means that, and these descriptions, that freedom, which is nibbana, is most often defined by what it is not. And it's not suffering. Here, freedom means one is unbound by patterns and habits that lead to dukkha. And one time someone asked the Buddha, where do enlightened beings go when they die? And the Buddha responded with another question. He said, where does the flame of a candle go when it is extinguished? So there's no fire, there's no source of the fire, so there's no fire. So If fire is analogous to cycling on the wheel of samsara and reactive cyclic patterns, the fire no longer burns. And nibbana is the result of exiting the cycles of samsara. So we are no longer being bound by tendencies associated with craving, clinging, hostility, and delusion. And there's been some academics and some scholars who have talked about nibbana as annihilation, but it's not that. Rather than a nothing, the Buddha is reported to have said in reference to nibbana that there is an unborn, an unbecome, an unmade, an unconditioned, the existence of which, well, it's not really, I don't know if you can say that, I'm just putting that in brackets, makes possible escape from the born, the become, the made, and the conditioned. So, unconditioned. And according to Ajahn Brahm, another way the Buddha described Nibbana was also as the highest happiness. And the great Ajahn Chah described Nibbana as the reality of non-clinging. That's the gem. That's great. So it's nothing. You can't say it is anything, but it's definitely not something. You can't make a thing out of it. It's not a thing. So when we don't cling, when we don't have hostility, when there's no longer greed, ignorance, and hatred, then there's no longer dukkha. And that's nibbana. In Theravada Buddhism, there are 4 stages of awakening that are put forward, which are described as path and fruit. The path relates to an awakening experience, and the fruit refers to the realizations and changes from that experience. And a sotapanna, or a stream enterer, has a glimpse of nibbana. There's a glimpse of it, and is free from, well, actually, I'll just go back a bit here. One way these 4 stages of awakening are described as is by the fetters. There's 10 fetters that we become free from in progressive order. And the sotapanna, the first stage of awakening, the first of 4, is also called a stream enterer, has a glimpse of nibbana and is free from 3 of the fetters. These fetters are, the first one is free from identity view. It's called Sakkaya Ditthi. And this identity view, it's not the same as letting go of the conceit I am. That's further down the path. That's actually one of the final things to let go of. And I'll talk about it in a minute. But Sakkaya Ditthi is this view that people are things. That's one way I can describe it. The person who has had a glimpse, or the being that's had a glimpse of Nibbana, realizes that has this view that individuals are not separate entities, but separate contained entities, but well, streams of dependently arising processes interacting. They see them as there's no kind of view that they're an unchanging self or a permanent soul in individuals. So it's a view. It's not the complete realization of not self, but it's a realization of not self, but not deep enough for it to be lasting, but it is deep enough for it to change a particular perspective on this view. The other thing, the other fetter that they're free from is attachment to rites and rituals. Now, the way I can explain this is that we might have this idea that if we do particular practices or, follow a particular, do a particular rite or a ritual, that it's going to wake us up. Well, what the Sotapanna realizes that there's no, that doesn't happen. The way you wake up is by, going through the Four Noble Truths, kind of complete realization of the Four Noble Truths. The third fetter that is no longer present in the stream enterer is doubt about the teachings. There's an unshakable confidence in the teachings of the Buddha. One just knows. So the next stage of awakening is called the once returner, or the Sakadagamin. And what happens with this one is sensual desire and ill will. These are two of the five hindrances. They're greatly attenuated. They're greatly reduced. The third stage is called non-returner, anagami. And in this stage, one is free completely from sensual desire and ill will. It's pretty good. And then we have, so we're up to 5 of these 10 fetters. A fetter is something that holds us back. The Arahant is free from all of the 5 lower fetters and the 5 higher fetters, which are, the next one is, this is a fetter. One's attachment to the meditation absorptions, which are the first 4 jhanas, clinging to the first 4 jhanas, the rupa jhanas, the jhanas of form. The 7th fetter, which the Arahant is completely free from, is attachment to the 4 formless jhanas. There's sometimes these are described as the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th jhana, and other times they're talked about as formless absorptions. But they're very refined states of samadhi, to say, they're very refined states of concentration, and their experience is formless. In other words, it's just mental experience, quite refined and very, very liberating, but not complete liberation. And so the Arahant is completely free from attachment to that. The Arahant is also free from the conceit I am, this idea that we are somebody, that we, there's a little me somewhere deep inside that's aware of everything that's going on here. The belief in I, me, and myself, which, it's a fiction. So the Arahant is free from that. And the Arahant is also free from restlessness, which is this kind of restlessness. Here is that, it's that's the 4th hindrance. It's that restlessness and agitation and remorse, worry, anxiety. The mind's kind of shaken around, completely free from that. And the Arahant is also completely free from the last fetter, which is ignorance, which is also called delusion, or not seeing the way things are. The Arahant knows and sees the way things are and is completely present. No wavering from this, always coming from present perspective. Sometimes these stages are described as sudden attainments, as 4 distinct and sudden changes. However, the sutras also talk about the path as having a gradual development. And sometimes it's like being compared to how the shells of an ocean drop away. That's kind of a slow and gradual drop away, and then you might find a shelf dropping off. It's like that. And sometimes we may have awakening experiences and think that it's irreversible enlightenment. With the stages of awakening, there's no kind of going back, if that makes sense. The stream enterer is called a stream enterer because he or she or they enter this awakening perspective and they get taken along by the stream. It's like they're in the stream. They can't go back. They can't do certain things. They can't do certain things that will create the conditions for them to return to a former state, if that makes sense. So they're going along in a stream. And ideally, it's like the stream goes along and along and along and eventually settles into the expanse of the ocean, which is like an arahant. So sometimes we may have experiences and we think they're, awakening experiences, and we want to share it with the world as something we have attained. And we become preoccupied with it, trying to often assess our level of awakening. We're going through the checklist, we're looking in the sutras, and is there any of that? Yeah, maybe I'm free from that. And it's easy and natural for the ego to look at the markers and the stages of our awakening and compare and so on. Unfortunately, this urge to kind of think about it and compare and all the rest of it is just a form of conceit, actually. And it can be quite delusional. We can really get ourselves caught up in all sorts of problems. And interestingly, in the rules of the monastics, in the 227 precepts for the male monastics, and I can't remember how many there are for females. I think it's like 300 and something. There's more for females. In the rules, it's forbidden to make any claims of spiritual attainments, regardless of whether they're true or not. And this is because it provides a risk, it causes a risk in the unity of the Sangha and also in the confidence of lay supporters. And it also feeds into a sense of conceit, like an I am. And often it's a sense of superiority, that I'm better than someone else. And it can be completely delusional. So it's dangerous. And I remember hearing about how Ajahn Chah, and some of you have heard this talk before, and you've probably heard me mention this before anyway. But I remember hearing that Ajahn Chah went to Insight Meditation Society in the US in the late 1970s. And he had various meditation practitioners lining up to ask him about their attainments, like, what level of awakening am I at? And Ajahn Chah just kind of asked them, are you still suffering? And they say, yes. And he said, well, you still got work to do. That was it. And I really like, reading this wonderful book called Stillness Flowing by Jayasaro Bhikkhu, which is the life and teachings of Ajahn Chah. People would often go to him and ask him about their attainments as monastics, even though you're not supposed to kind of even consider that, but they'd go and ask him about it. And he would always respond by saying something like, in Thai, my nair, which means you're never certain. No one can be ever certain. And, the reality of it is, I don't think you can be certain until you really know it for sure. And that the only beings that know for sure are arahants. So it's just not worth it. I had a period, there were some experiences I had, or an experience I had when I was young in Thailand, actually. And I thought it was an awakening experience, and I, kind of going through the checklists and comparing and or doing all those things. And I just realized after a while it was just a waste of time. It was just, it wasn't worth it. It was just too much. I realized that really what I wanted was my ego validated, and say, yeah, yes, you've attained something. So I just kind of let it go. And in more recent years, I have had the thought, I am realized, arise. Oh, I've had this experience. That was an awakening experience. And I found myself, when I've had that thought come up, I found myself cringing to it, because it's actually an oxymoron. That is, when we genuinely wake up, we realize there is no self to appropriate spiritual badges of honor. There's no self there to be awake. When we wake up, we realize that this self we call, this thing we call, this stream of dependently arising processes and interactions is actually just a stream. It's no single thing in it. It's just moment to moment. So there's nobody that wakes up. I'm sorry. Nobody wakes up. But I think there is, and there's no reference point to say I am anything. And in fact, the self is no longer a priority. I think if we, and it doesn't really matter whether we're, genuinely on that stages of awakening or not, we just start to realize that there is a certain sense of relief about letting go of the burden of the ego. There's a wonderful relief that letting go of the conceit I am. And when we look into it, the clinging out to the I, mine, and myself begins to erode away. And that's freeing, so freeing. And I know that I know we need to still function and adhere to social norms and so on. We need to still be a somebody, in the world, like I'm a psychologist and I'm a granddad and all those things. And we need to function like that. But there is also a certain clarity that all there is now. All there is now. And everything else, and I know some of you have heard me say this many times, everything else is just a story. We become very clear that the world is our mental fabrication. Yeah. I'm sitting here with you now, and I have this big story about what I've got to do later and what I did yesterday. But there's a kind of a self-identity with that past, and what self-identity with what's going to happen in the future. But in reality, it's just the fiction. It's just a story. So if we can kind of recognize that every now and then, it's a lot freer. We live with a lot more freedom. We live with there's still, if somebody says something about us, and you kind of feel the shadow of someone in the past or something in the past that would have been stung by that comment, but there's no sting. There's no kind of hurt. And one feels much lighter and freer, and there's a certain sense of presence, which is really quiet. It's really quiet. Analia once said that compassion without emptiness is exhausting, while emptiness without compassion is toxic. And I think regardless of whether these stages can be confirmed, or regardless of whether there's stages or not, when we embark on the path of Dhamma and we begin to wake up to whatever level we wake up, whether it's a noble or or noble, it's there's a realization that we're no longer the center of the universe, and in this world with others. And we realize that even though the world is a mental construction, there is another. There is someone else out there. And this is the kind of mystery of this, how this works together. And what naturally happens is we have compassion. When we encounter another being or the world, compassion arises. And one is clear from one's own self-obsessions. So I was on a retreat with Nalio just last week. I think it will finish last week. It was a mindfulness and breathing retreat, and it was wonderful. I was listening to the Q&A. It was fantastic. And I think Analia was asked about awakening experiences, and he said, "What's the use of awakening if you don't, if you don't go out and help other people? What's the use of it?" So when we release the idea of a separate self, what naturally arises is compassion and compassionate service for the common good. We serve and are part of common humanity, and we serve and have an inclination towards compassion and kindness and joy and equanimity towards all beings. So thanks very much for your listening, and may we all wake up from this dream of samsara to realize the unconditioned within the conditioned, and realize the reality of non-clinging and its freedom. Thank you. So let's have a few moments of quiet to absorb or let go of the Dhamma talk, just to kind of let it settle. And we'll come back and have questions and discussions and sharing.